Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We still have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We've got some great friends of the show on today. Matt Taibbi is going to talk about the media's approach to the Biden era. That will be interesting. We've got David Sirota on. He's got some new reporting about the Biden administration's plans with regards to healthcare, how they're walking back some of their key promises and giving favors away already to the health insurance industry. But we wanted to start actually with the Biden foreign policy, which is starting to a little bit take shape, and we'll do a little tour of the world for you this morning.
Yeah, this is important. Look, this is the area where the president of the United States has the most power. And so we need to take like kind of a survey of the land. And the most important one that we should start with is obviously nuclear war. Usually the top thing. So the Biden administration is actually seeking to have a 5-year extension on the New START treaty with Russia. This is something that was actually exited out of by the Trump administration, saying that the Russians were cheating on their restrictions and it actually was stopping the development of a new U.S. nuclear arsenal. The Biden administration reversing that key policy. But, and this is the problem, and this is what we warned about from the very beginning around Russiagate, Aaron Mate very astutely observed this. Let's throw his tweet up there on the screen, which is that they are going to tie punishment for the solar winds hack and for, and basically, quote unquote, impose costs for their intel community assessments on Russia as a condition of this new treaty. As he says, these threatened costs are the cost of Russiagate. Reversing, the Trump decision in order to get out of New START is now being paired with election interference and a lot of the mentality that we saw. Same thing with Ukrainegate. This was always the fear, which is that we are now orienting U.S. foreign policy on our nuclear arsenal around a complete conspiracy theory about the way that Russia interfered in our elections, quote unquote, back in 2016, and largely because of this new democratic animus. And so if we tank this treaty, and let's say we tank our entire relationship with Russia over a total conspiracy theory, this has real world consequences. Like, this is not a joke. Russia has a massive nuclear arsenal, second, I think, to China in terms of how good it is and in terms of its ability in order to strike the United States. And sacrificing that at the altar of a conspiracy theory shows you just how dangerous this has permeated the entire national security establishment.
Yeah, Russia's nuclear arsenal is actually, I think the stat I read, 10 times larger than China's. Yeah. So it's extraordinarily significant. The thing that's interesting here is the Biden-Russia policy as expressed so far is deeply confused. And even the experts that they quoted in the Washington Post sort of pointed to this tension between, on the one hand, they've said essentially, yes, we're going back in a New START, the full 5-year extension, something I 100% support, something that everyone in the arms control community, as far as I can tell, also supports. That's a good thing. And that's the opposite of what the Trump administration did. They walked away from that treaty. So that's a positive. On the other hand, they have all this rhetoric about how they're going to be tougher and they're going to be more aggressive and they're going to impose these costs. And that comes directly out of that Russiagate conspiracy and out of the fact that, yes, within the Democratic base, there's now this like obsessive animus towards Russia. I'm old enough to remember when Democrats used to make fun of Republicans for their like Cold War era obsession with Russia. But now that shoe is on the other foot. And so if the policy seems confused, it's because it is. Why is it confused? Because the Trump policy was also confused. Mm-hmm. Trump did the opposite thing of like saying the really nice things about Russia that triggered everybody and was like, oh my God, how can you be so nice to Vladimir Putin? But while doing the wrong-headed, hawkish actual policy maneuvers, because that's where his party was and he didn't ultimately pay enough attention to the details to really care. So the policy direction of the Republican Party and of the Trump administration was actually very aggressive, was actually very hardline vis-a-vis Russia. So because their policy was confused, when the Biden administration comes in and is basically like, we're just going to do the reverse of what Trump did, you end up once again with a very confused policy. The Washington Post quoted an expert, I think somebody actually from the George W. Bush administration, who said, this is the first administration since the end of the Soviet Union who has come in seeking a more aggressive stance toward Russia versus trying to have the more cooperative diplomatic approach. So yes, this right here, what we're witnessing, this obsession with we've got to have the new intel, we've got to impose these costs on Russia, and even this obsessive focus on Russia really comes directly out of Russiagate and is the cost for that whole conspiracy.
It was my greatest fear with Biden, and now it seems to be realized. Look, Russia is a dying petrostate. They literally have a shrinking population, and their GDP is a joke. I mean, they are a second-rate nation. And yeah, they happen to have nukes that they inherited from when they actually used to be big and a superpower. That doesn't mean you orient all of U.S. global foreign policy around this objective, especially when you have China and the Near East and our own troop problems in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And speaking of Iraq, this is the same thing that I feared, which is that when you have a president like Biden who has no real ideology or philosophy around foreign policy, purely reactive, then you can lead to situations like what we're now in with New Start, where we're letting the Russiagate conspiracy, infect how they're negotiating with Russia. Look at this new report from the Jerusalem Post. Let's throw it up there on the screen, which is that the Biden administration is considering reversing the Trump drawdown in Iraq by adding thousands of combat troops to growing terror threats in the region, as evidenced by the Thursday attack near the U.S. Embassy. I have news for everybody. Those attacks are going to continue in Baghdad probably for the next 30 or 40 years. And more U.S. combat troops in Iraq is not going to do a goddamn thing about it. You can ask the 165,000 troops at one point, which were deployed there and were still getting massacred by IEDs, probably in the same neighborhood in Baghdad. And this is the thing that drives me crazy, Krystal, which is that this could easily be lauded by the national security establishment as reversing the Trump policy, which quote unquote, left our troops less safe in Iraq. So again, what is the barrier of success? What is the benchmark of success? Is it that we cannot leave Iraq until Baghdad is a safe and secure zone? Well, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for decades. And it'll be like us and maybe a few others, dissident voices who are like, hey, actually, this is a really bad idea. And also, if you want to have a deal with Iran, then sending a bunch of troops to Iraq and to Baghdad is probably the last thing that you probably want to do. It's just has no coherence in terms of their foreign policy. And who suffers? It's the U.S. soldiers who have to go over there and, might get killed by a rocket or step on an IED out on a combat troll. For what? For nothing. I mean, it's just the same perma forever war. And he very much could walk into a massive trap.
So the common thread that you will see throughout this segment, with one very notable exception that we'll get to, is basically the Biden policy is to do the reverse of whatever the Trump policy was. Whether the Trump policy was good, bad, or indifferent, we're just going to take that and we're going to do the opposite, right? So that's the instinct that you see here with Iraq. And look, we haven't had any official announcements yet, so we will withhold complete judgment until we see exactly what the policy is. But the fact that they're already trying to look for these justifications for why we need to increase our number of troops in the region again is a deeply troubling sign. And I really do think that it comes right out of this, whatever Trump did, that must have been bad. No thinking about it, no evaluation of it, no consideration of the nuance around it, and whether, hey, sometimes Trump did occasionally do things that were the step in the right direction. If Trump did it, it's wrong. So that leads to the very mixed bag picture that we see in their approach really around the globe. So with Russia, again, you have going back in the New START treaty, good. You have, but we're going to be super aggressive with our rhetoric and impose costs and sanctions, et cetera. Bad. You have Iraq, where this was the one positive thing Trump did was to start to draw down. He should have removed troop presence altogether, but at least he drew down the presence in the region. They're saying, okay, we're going to do the opposite and ramp it back up. Another area that is potentially good, although there are still a lot of question marks there, is on Iran. New Press Secretary Jen Psaki got asked about their approach to re-entering that JCPOA nuclear deal that was negotiated under the Obama administration. Let's take a listen to what she had to say about that.
What are the next steps when it comes to Iran, and does the president have any plans to rejoin the nuclear deal?
Well, the president has made clear that he believes that through follow-on diplomacy, the United States should seek to lengthen and strengthen nuclear constraints on Iran and address other issues of concern. Iran must resume compliance with significant nuclear constraints under the deal in order for that to proceed. I will say that, as I noted a little bit earlier, we would expect that some of his earlier conversations with foreign counterparts or foreign leaders will be with partners and allies, and that we would certainly anticipate that this would be part of the discussion.
So on Iran, you can see, look, openness to going back into the deal. I think that's incredibly important. I think it's a really positive thing. I actually think it was one of the best things that came out of the Obama administration. Unclear, though, when they're talking about these, constraints in Iran going back into meeting their requirements, their obligations under the deal. I mean, the U.S. we were the ones who stepped away from the deal. So that may be a tough pill to swallow from Iran. We'll see if ultimately they're able to negotiate and get back in that deal. And, that one is still sort of a question mark. On the other hand, there are some positive signs. The envoy that they've named to Iran is someone who is really respected and was deeply part of negotiating that original deal. So we'll see there. In that one instance, it seems like the imperative to do the opposite of whatever Trump did may actually end up in a decent place.
Yeah, it might. I mean, here's the thing. The clock is ticking. The Iranian elections are coming up. They definitely have been enriching more uranium in the past. In terms of how it is all going to come together, we have no idea, but they're going to have to sprint towards that thing if they actually want to make it happen. And just to be balanced and fair, wanted to also highlight this one, which is that obviously I have been very critical of Biden's past policy towards China. And my greatest fear is that him and his administration would basically just reverse back to where we were. And I was heartened to see this from the future Secretary of State, or I guess Secretary of State designate, if he is confirmed, Anthony Blinken. He was actually asked about Secretary Pompeo's designation that the Chinese government is committing genocide in Xinjiang during his confirmation hearings. And he said he agreed with that decision. So let's take a listen to that.
We're very much in agreement. And the forcing men, women, and children into concentration camps, trying to, in effect, re-educate them to be adherents to the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. All of that speaks to an effort to commit genocide. And so I agree with that finding. I think we have to look at the tools that we have available to us, including some of the tools that the Congress has provided, to see what actions we can take.
So that's what we talked about yesterday, Krystal, on the show, which is that, look, the Chinese government's got a target on the back of any U.S. official that is going to go after them. They will sanction you. They will, kill your future business dealings. They will make your life a living hell whenever you try to work in the private sector. And so Anthony Blinken, who actually has done business on behalf of Fortune 500 companies entering into China, at least he's standing up there. So look, we'll see. That is a very significant position for him to take. It will mean, they're using that word as the Secretary of State of the United States means, and it automatically triggers a whole set of policy sanctions and other things. We will see what the Biden overall policy towards China is, but it seems like they are not going to at least be going in the full direction that we feared, which was a total reversal of some of the Trump administration's posture there.
Yeah. And I mean, it is very telling, just going back to the top of what we were talking about. It's very telling that the country who we have the clearest picture of what the Biden foreign policy is going to be vis-a-vis is Russia. Russia has become the obsession. That's the first big thing that was announced, getting back in this treaty, but we're going to impose these costs. Like, that's the one where we have kind of the clearest direction. And I also think, zooming out a bit, this is something that we've been talking about for months and months here before Biden was even elected. There's a real danger to having a president who doesn't really have a foreign policy ideology or vision or approach. Biden, like Trump, weirdly, has this very sort of relationship-driven approach to foreign policy. So it's very ad hoc. It's very piecemeal. That means that you can be subject easily to flattery. It means you can be subject to the lazy thinking of, like, whatever Trump did, I'm going to do the opposite. And that leads to the overall picture likely to be a real mixed bag. So we're reading the tea leaves on a lot of this to show you the kind of direction that they seem to be headed towards. overall, I think the general instinct is going to be that whatever Trump did, we're going to do the reverse. But we do see some notable departures from that on China, which is probably a good thing. And then on Venezuela, which is definitely a bad thing right for you. Blinken's comments about Guaido and our need to restore democracy in Venezuela. So I guess the foreign policy establishment still very much king in Washington, D.C.
100%. Look, it's all over the map. We'll keep you guys updated. It's going to be an interesting 4 years. That's one thing we know.
Absolutely. All right, more Eisen for you after this.